Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. What, why, and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up daily edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 30th of September 2023. The articles that we shall be covering today have been displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion. Before we begin with the discussion, here is a very important announcement. We are beginning with the new batches of optional on 6th. And on 6th, 9th and 10th October, you can attend for free to experience firsthand the magic of result-driven education by all our optional faculties. There is a link in the description where you can register for the free demo classes on these 3 days, and all the very best. The first article that we have taken is not only revealing in terms of the grim reality of our country, but is also extremely pertinent for the syllabus, especially GS Paper 3 mains, and questions in prelims have also been asked from this question, and that deals with public distribution system. The distribution system of food grains, which enables almost all of us, especially people below the poverty line, to access food at dismally low cost of rupees 1, 2 and 3. And this is just one of the instances where we get to read the issues and challenges being faced by the poor in our country to access the public distribution system. There are a lot of issues. This topic is very important from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination. For example, in 2019, UPSC had asked, the economic cost of food grains to the Food Corporation of India is minimum support price and bonus if any paid to farmers plus A. transportation cost only, B. interest cost only, C. procurement incidentals and distribution cost, and D. procurement incidentals and charges for godowns. Now I'm not going to tell you the answer because the answer lies in the discussion. Not just that, the public distribution system also forms the part of GS Paper 3 under main syllabus because issues related to direct and indirect farm subsidies and minimum support prices, public distribution system objectives, functioning, limitation and revamping is a part of your syllabus. And UPSC sticks to syllabus because again in 2019, UPSC had asked what are the reformative steps taken by the government to make food grain distribution system more effective. So you can see that this topic is important for both the stages of examination, prelims as well as the main stage. And so go through this discussion where we are going to start by first understanding the mechanism or the framework through which the grain is finally delivered on the gates of the beneficiaries. And then finally, what are the challenges which the public distribution system is facing. And try to solve this previous year question in prelims and mains and see if you were able to do that with this discussion. And so let us now first understand how does a bag of grains reaches the beneficiary starting from a farm. We know that farmers do not directly go to the beneficiary. That is not an option, right? And so it exchanges a lot of hand before it ends up in the hands of beneficiary. And so of course, the first stage in the long chain of events is done by FCI, which is called procurement of grains. Food Corporation of India exchanges these grains in return of minimum support price or MSP. So the food of grain is given to FCI and in return FCI gives the farmer MSP. And this MSP is paid and declared by the central government. And so at the first stage, the ownership to the grains is acquired by an agency of central government. But we know that they have to end up in the hands of beneficiaries. And so it is important for them to be acquired by the state governments. And that is the second stage of this long chain of events. So in the second stage, the food grains are allocated to the states depending upon the number of beneficiaries that they have in their respective states. Now the question is, does FCI charges any money from the state governments? And so the answer is yes. Food Corporation of India is not going to give away the food grains, lakhs and lakhs tons of these food grains for free to state governments. And it charges some amount in return from state governments, which is what is known as CIP or Central Issue Price, the price at which the food grains are allocated to the states. So now you can clearly see what FCI spends for getting that food grain is MSP, but what it gets in return is CIP. But the grains are still not at the door of beneficiaries. because the grains are still lying in the godowns of the state government, from where they are allocated to the fair price shops. These fair price shops are the last linkage between the state government and the final beneficiary. From here, the beneficiary take up their allocation of food grains at central issue price, exact price which the state had paid to the FCI. And so this is a whole framework through which our public distribution system operates. From this point beyond, if someone asks you what is minimum support price or MSP, and so you are going to confidently say that MSP is a price at which the food grains are bought from farmers, and hence it is the price which is paid to the farmers. It is paid by FCI, but it is recommended by CACP or Commission for Agriculture Cost and Prices, and it is of course declared by central government. Whereas central issue price is a price at which food grains are allocated to states. At the same time, beneficiary also pays central issue price in return of food grains over here. Now there is one more perspective about MSP which you should know, which is that MSP, of course every one of us understands, is about ensuring a minimum support price to farmer, or in other words, ensuring at least some amount of income to the farmers. But at the same time, it is also about the food subsidy burden of the central government. Because higher the MSP, higher is the amount of money which the central government has to invest on acquiring that food grain. Now, whenever we talk about the food subsidy bill of the central government, we always read one thing: it is increasing. It keeps on increasing always. And why is that? Because people will say that FCI is spending MSP, but in return it is getting CIP. And so why is it a burden on central government? And so, if you have to calculate food subsidy expenditure of the central government, the first and foremost will be minimum support price, which it gives to the farmers, which is an expenditure. In return, it gets central issue price from the states, which is what they get in return, which is what FCI gets in return. At the same time, there are few other expenses on behalf of the central government. For example, when the food grain is acquired from the farmers, it is kept in godowns and silos, and it is transported to the state governments and their godowns, and all that cost is borne by the central government. So on behalf of the central government, the expenses are MSP plus transportation and storage costs, which is additional cost, and what they are earning in this exchange is central issue price. Now, if you look at the framework which governs our public distribution system at present, which is National Food Security Act or NFSA, the central issue prices have been fixed for a very, very long time. So for example, if you go and check on these prices, the prices of wheat, rice and various other products have been fixed at rupees 1, 2 and 3 and not more than that. Whereas what you read in newspaper is that government has increased MSP. And this happens every harvesting season. And so on one hand, MSP keeps on increasing because the income to the farmer has to increase. On the other hand, CIP remains fixed. So what the central government is spending on food subsidy keeps on increasing because what it is earning is constant and it is very, very small as compared to the MSP. The comparison is right there on your screen, and see how MSP has kept on increasing in past 20 years, whereas CIP is same, and hence the bloating food subsidy expenditure. So now we have understood the framework. But we have still not gone through the legal backing behind this framework. There has to be a legal arrangement which provides for this kind of acquisition, procurement, and then finally giving out these food grains to the beneficiaries. Now, some of you might think that it is dealt by National Food Security Act, but that is not true. Now, the basic framework through which the public distribution system in our country operates is derived from Essential Commodities Act. Because Essential Commodities Act 1955 gives the central government powers to do certain special things. Utilizing the provisions of this act, the central government came out with Public Distribution System Control Order 2001, which regulates the prices, cultivation of crops, its storage and distribution, and how it is going to be done. So the basic framework of PDS The basic framework through this part of the chain operates is determined by PDSCO 2001 order derived from Essential Commodities Act 1955. Then, a very important Supreme Court judgment, PUCL versus Union of India 2001 judgment, under which Supreme Court of India ruled that right to food will be covered under right to life and personal liberty of Article 21. And from other DNS discussions, you might be aware how Supreme Court has from time to time expanded the ambit of Article 21. And this is one such judgment which actually expanded the meaning of life and liberty in our country. And finally, in 2013, government came up with National Food Security Act, which actually legalized the right to food. Now, what National Food Security Act did was that it converted a very vague and general entitlement of the citizens of our country, backed by an executive order, into a proper statutory right, which was very important. So now, since we are done with the basic framework and we have the clear-cut legal understanding into how this works, it is time for us to explore what are the issues or the challenges which the PDS is facing from the longest time. At the same time, we will not keep ourselves limited to just the issues, and so we are going to deal into the solutions with each problem as well. And so whatever is written in red color is your problem with the PDS. Centralized procurement, government is a major buyer, so issues related to monopolistic tendencies, the changes in the cropping pattern which it has brought in its wake, higher procurements than needed, which then leads to lack of storage spaces, and then finally challenges with the distribution system. So these are the major challenges which the PDS is facing as of right now. And so let us now start with the problem number 1, which is centralized procurement. So currently the procurement is centralized in the sense that almost all the grain currently is acquired on MSP by the Food Corporation of India, or in other words, the central government. And so there is no role for states or state governments in the way the grains are being procured. And this of course leads to very high transportation costs. And now the question is, why does centralized procurement leads to higher transportation costs? Now you have to understand that when the FCI acquires food grain from a particular area or a district, it goes to the central storage facility of FCI. But in the same area, there are poor people who are going to get the grain back as well. And so this, you can see, is unnecessary transport of grain from point A to B and then back to point A, which then of course results in very high transportation cost. It's just not us, government has also realized this problem, and so it has come up with decentralized procurement system, under which the central government has actually delegated the power of procurement to a lot of state governments, where they can acquire the food grains on their own and the central government is there to watch their backs. And the next important problem is a major problem, and that is a problem in all those commodities and markets where there is a single major player. In this case, it's Government of India, because Government of India is the major buyer in food grain market. And more often than not, the MSP which the government offers to the farmers is way higher than the prevailing market prices, which of course motivates the farmers to sell almost all the food grains, or at least try for it, to the Food Corporation of India, rather than selling it into the open market, which then results in artificial scarcity of those food grains. And for that, Government of India has come up with Open Market Sales Scheme and Price Stabilization Fund. Now, under the Open Market Sales Scheme, whatever excess the Food Corporation of India has procured in a particular financial year is sold in the open market at the prevailing prices, which then of course increases the supply of these food grains, reducing their prices in the market. Whereas Price Stabilization Fund is a fund which will be utilized when the prices of certain commodity or agriculture commodity for which the MSP is given has gone down. So the government utilizes that fund to acquire or procure extra grain from the market. This acquisition on behalf of the government increases the demand and hence the prices. Now currently, the food grains like rice and wheat are not covered under price stabilization fund, but there is a recommendation to include rice and wheat also under this price stabilization fund regime. Then the next problem which the PDS has brought in its wake is that it has induced monoculture or cropping or cultivation of single variety of food grain in a large area. So it has impacted the cropping pattern in our country. And the obvious reason is that farmers are more likely to take up only those food grains and crops for which they can be assured of assured return, which is MSP. And so, due to the MSP regime, due to the PDS, all those crops for which the MSP is not offered have actually gone out of cropping pattern. As a result of the reforms, the government of India has now tried to include more and more crops under the MSP regime so that more and more crops can get equal treatment as far as the prices are concerned and they do not go out of cropping pattern. Then the next problem with the way PDS functions is a higher procurement, higher than what is needed, which then leads to buildup of massive stocks in the godowns of Food Corporation of India. And the reason behind that is open-ended procurement policy of the government of India. Now, what open-ended procurement policy does is that it makes it an obligation on behalf of Food Corporation of India to buy all those food crops for which the government releases MSP if a farmer approaches. It doesn't matter what the target is. It doesn't matter how much they have acquired, but if a farmer comes at the gate of the godowns of Food Corporation of India with, let's say, a bag of rice, they have to acquire it, and this is what it leads to the massive buildup of the stocks in the godowns. And so there has been a growing demand to scrap this open-ended procurement policy. So we have understood that there are higher procurement which leads to massive stocks. This buildup of massive stocks create the problem of lack of storage space. And this obviously results in wastage because there is not enough space in the godowns of Food Corporation of India. And even if there is a space, after all, it is a government company which does not store the food grains in the most scientific way in which they should be stored, which then results in rotting. And for exactly this, the government of India has come up with private entrepreneurs guarantee scheme, under which the government of India is incentivizing entrepreneurs to come up with godowns, technologically advanced godowns in rural areas. They are being provided with various kinds of incentives to set up godowns. Now, what this is going to do is that first, FCI is going to store the food grains very safely and securely in these godowns. The creation of these godowns in turn is going to have multiplier effect in the areas surrounding, not just creating employment but also enhancing the infrastructure of our rural areas. And then finally, the problem is at the distribution level, the last mile delivery, the point from where the food grain is actually distributed from fair price shops to the final beneficiary. And you must have read in the newspaper about how the people who are entitled are not getting the food grains, which is called exclusion error, because they were wrongly excluded from the list of people who are supposed to get the food grains. Whereas there are a lot of people who get the food grains, but they were not entitled for that, which is called inclusion error. They were wrongly included into the list. And our PDS system has both kinds of error, which is not what we want. Because in both the cases, the food subsidy and the benefits is ending up with the wrong person. In one case, the right person is not getting it, and in the second case, the wrong person is getting it. Now, in this regard, the government of India has already started the work where they have tried to do end-to-end computerization of the whole PDS supply chain. But still, there is a need for online allocation of food grains, digitization of ration cards, and not just digitization, there is a need of complete seeding of these ration cards with Aadhaar. Also, it is time for us to think creatively as far as subsidy and food subsidy transfer is concerned. There is a need for the government to explore direct benefit transfer or DBT for food subsidy. For example, instead of giving the food, equal amount of cash can be transferred into the beneficiary's account. It has been tried, but it has its associated challenges with it. Then we know that government is already implementing one nation, one ration card, so that when a person migrates from one locality or one state to another, she is not deprived of her right to food. The next article for discussion is extremely important, especially from the overall dynamics of multilateralism panning out currently in the world, because it deals with one of the most important multilateral institutions that we have created so far, and that is World Trade Organization. The recently concluded G20 declaration, among its many commitments, reiterated the need to pursue reform of WTO to improve all its functions and conduct proactive discussions to ensure a fully and well functioning dispute settlement system accessible to all members by 2024. Now, in this sentence, a lot of things would not be making sense to you. For example, what is multilateralism? And so, if you want to know about multilateralism, you can watch another DNS where we have discussed the concept of multilateralism and what are the threats to it. But if you don't want to watch that video, you can simply understand it to be an institution which is created as a result of 3 or more nations coming together to form an institution. So WTO is a multilateral institution, UN is a multilateral institution, WHO is a multilateral institution. And so this article mainly focuses upon the dispute settlement system or DSS of the WTO, which had been dysfunctional for quite a long time. And this has actually created a major hurdle in the path of the countries taking WTO seriously. But nothing of that will make sense to you unless and until we go through a discussion. Now, why is it important for civil services examination? Now, if you have seen the syllabus of GS paper 2, you must have seen an important line. Important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure, mandate. And so in this regard, not just for the prelims examination, obviously this is important for that, but from the perspective of mains examination, there are few things which are very important. And so in this regard, we will start by first understanding why is there a need for such an international organization. Why in the backdrop of World War II, a need was felt for that, GATT was created, and then finally WTO took it from there. So we'll understand the basics of WTO, its advantages, and then finally we will look into the challenges currently being faced by WTO. Now starting with the basics, because most of our viewers are quite new and for them it is very important to understand how and why it was created. So before WTO there existed a GATT or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It more or less functioned on the same lines, which was created in 1948 to regulate world trade. And it was created as a means to boost economic recovery after Second World War by reducing and eliminating trade tariffs, quotas and subsidies. So during the Great Depression, a breakdown of international relations and an increase in trade regulation made poor economic condition even worse, and it contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. And just as the war finished, allies believed that a multilateral framework for the world trade would loosen the protectionist policies that defined 1930s. Now, what are the protectionist policies and what are these tariffs and quotas and subsidies? So these are a way to carry out protectionism, which is a practice of following protectionist state policy, which allows for the government of a country to promote its own domestic producers, service providers, and thereby boost their domestic production of goods and services. For example, let's say if there is a government contract, and if Government of India mandates that only Indian companies can bid for that contract, that is a kind of protectionism. Similarly, let's say that Government of India puts a limit on how much cars can be imported, let's say 100 per year, that is a quota. Similarly, Government of India can impose, let's say 100% import duty on a lot of products, and that is tariff. Or in other ways, the Government of India can provide domestic producer of cars 50% rebate in, let's say, iron and steel. And so that is a subsidy. And so all these kinds of measures are called protectionist policies. So the taxes or duties imposed on imports are known as tariffs. Restriction on the volume of import are known as quotas. And negative taxes or tax credits are known as subsidies. So these are the three main ways of providing protection. And let us understand them by an image which you can see on your screen. So these are tariffs. Then government provides subsidies, which allows producers to lower the price of local goods and services because they are getting benefits from the government. Then you impose quotas. And then no matter how low a fee sets the price through subsidies, it cannot ship more goods because there is a limit on how much you can import. And even if that good is very cheap, you cannot import more than that. And then finally, you tweak with the currency. Deliberate attempt by a country to lower its currency value, which would make its exports cheaper and more competitive. So in the build-up of World War II, most developed countries across the world increasingly resorted to these four methods, and because of which the global trade was suffering, because protectionism has its own fair share of disadvantages. Of course, it offers more growth opportunity, lower imports, more jobs, and higher GDP for the local population or for the residents of the country. But in the longer term, it is not good for any economy. Why? Because first and foremost, it leads to stagnation of technological advancement. As domestic producers don't need to worry about foreign competition, they have no incentive to innovate or spend resources on R&D of new products. Similarly, there is very limited choice for consumers. If you ask your parents about the choices they had about electronics goods or even cars, they would tell you that they were not available because consumers have access to fewer goods in a market as a result of limitations on how much foreign goods can be imported because of protectionist policies. There is increase in prices due to lack of competition. Consumers will need to pay more without seeing any significant improvement in the product. And since there are very less number of choices, consumer has to choose what is available. And finally, it leads to economic isolation. Because there are high tariffs, there are quotas, and there are subsidies given to local markets and local producers, that country or that economy becomes to grow increasingly distant from other economies, and so the exchange of ideas is minimum, and which leads to not just economic but also political and cultural isolation. Just try to think of North Korea when you talk about protectionism. It's just not economically isolated but also culturally and politically. And so that is why a need was felt to create an organization which would counter protectionism, would liberalize trade by reducing tariffs and removing quotas among member countries. This will not just counter protectionism but increase in global trade, which would then boost the war-ravaged economy of World War II scenario. And so in this context, GATT was thought of. Ultimately, it was taken over by WTO later on, but this is the context in which WTO works. So far, we have understood why it is important to have a global institution working towards a global trade or a rule-based trading system. So some important aspects of WTO is that it was established in 1995, or rather it took over or changed its form from GATT to WTO, and it is a successor of that, and it deals just not with goods, which was the main emphasis of GATT, but it deals with services, intellectual property, dispute settlement, as well as trade monitoring. An important aspect is that it is not a specialized agency of United Nations, although it has an arrangement with the United Nations through which it maintains strong relation with United Nations. So this is a very important information. And so WTO functions for smooth, free and predictable global trade, or for the creation of free trade, which is a policy that means governments do not charge people to import or bring in goods from other countries or make exporter pay taxes to send their goods abroad. Because you need to understand that when companies invest in other countries, they want the trading rules to not change suddenly in their disadvantage. And for that, they need protection. And so that framework is provided by WTO. And so it is important for us to understand and appreciate the advantages which are derived from WTO. So first and foremost is that it talks about a gradual reduction of tariffs. As you can clearly see the example of United States on your screen. On your y-axis we have tariffs as a percentage of imports, and on x-axis you have years. And if you start looking from 1940, you can clearly see a gradual reduction in the import duties imposed by United States. And similar is the case with other countries as well. And so it talks about gradual reduction of tariffs, and through which it wants to promote free trade. Then it acts as a legal framework, not just for negotiation of countries or among them, but also for other kinds of trade barriers as well. Then it enables trade without any discrimination, and it is not like that WTO is just a body vouching for free trade or completely free trade, which means no tariffs, no barriers, no quotas, nothing. It allows for tariffs and trade restrictions under certain conditions. For example, if a country A feels that a country B is exporting very cheap raw material which is artificially deflated, then the country A can impose duties without violating WTO rules. Similarly, there are clauses such as national security which a country can utilize to impose significant barriers to trade for a specific country. And then finally, all these rules are to protect fair competition because there are rules which member countries have to abide by. Whether it is about subsidies or contracts or import or export, once you become a member of WTO, your national rules have to align by the general framework. And so that is how the disadvantages of protectionism are countered. It leads to lower prices for consumers because then imports become cheaper. It promotes fair trade because then foreign companies can function in any of the countries which are member and can expect a fair treatment from the government. Then it leads to specialization because when all companies are treated equally, then the companies can produce a product anywhere across the world. And that location is mainly decided by the factor of manufacturing cost and not other policies like quotas and tariffs and other barriers. And finally, it leads to the development of economies of scale. Because by encouraging free trade, firms can specialize and produce higher quantity. This enables even more economies of scale, which is important for industries, especially in the current context. And the success of WTO is demonstrated by the raw data. WTO has over 160 members representing 98% of world trade. There has been an increase in the trade dispute which have been brought to WTO, showing that WTO indeed has become a forum to help resolve these disputes. Also, WTO regulations have helped avoid a major trade war. And finally, let's see the data. So on your screen, this graph shows world exports as a percentage of GDP. So on the y-axis, you have exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP, and on x-axis, you have timeline, and you can clearly see an increasing trend throughout. So this clearly shows increasing global trade in last 50 years since the time a global rule-based order was established in global trade. Despite all its advantages, there are some issues, and they are significant ones. There are a lot of areas where WTO has been severely criticized. On one hand, it is true that it has led to counter-protectionism, but on the other hand, it is also true that it has given rise to inequalities, not just in terms of wealth, but also in terms of industrial and other kinds of development. Let us understand how. So first and foremost criticism of WTO is that it is unfavorable to developing nations because it is derived from GATT, which was established in the context of World War II, and all the victors and the global north came together to frame a rule which was very beneficial to them. For example, let's take the case of tariff protection. This is the way which was resorted to by developed countries during the time of Industrial Revolution. They utilized heavy import duties to stop the import of goods from foreign countries. US did it to exclude Germany, Germany did it to exclude Britain, and each one of them did for each other. They utilized these tariff and quotas to grow their economy. And now once they are developed, they have access to technology, they have access to capital, and now they want developing countries to significantly reduce their tariff barriers. They want India to significantly reduce and continuously lower their import duties. And so we know that countries like India and other countries do not have industrial base. And at that point of time, if the import duty is significantly reduced, it leads to the import of cheaper products from foreign countries, and then which further deters the industrial growth. And the second reason why it is unfavorable to developing nations is the categorization of most favored nation by WTO. So under WTO agreement, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. So for example, they cannot grant someone a special favor such as a lower custom duty or rate, and if you do it for one, you will have to do it for others as well. So what does that mean? That means that if India is providing special treatment to a third country A, it will have to provide the same treatment to company from USA, a company from China. And that is a problem because companies from USA and China are pretty strong, right? Negotiating at WTO or any of its meetings require a very high level of specialized and technical knowledge of not just the law but also about nuances of trade and economy, which developing countries generally do not have. And since they do not have that kind of human resource which can negotiate on their behalf, more often than not the agreements, especially for African countries, are designed against them. And of course, when it is unfavorable to developing countries, in more aspects, it is favorable to developing nations. Because the way negotiations have been designed or the way agreements work, they enable various kinds of protection. And these protections are applicable only for developed countries. Let's take the Agreement on Agriculture, which is the framework which governs the farm subsidies of WTO, which is the agreement of WTO which governs the farm subsidies. It has categorized the farm subsidies into trade distorting domestic subsidies and non-trade distorting subsidies. So all those subsidies which are trade distorting shall have to be eliminated, whereas all which are not trade distorting can go on. So all trade distorting subsidies are categorized under amber box, whereas non-trade distorting subsidies are categorized under blue and green boxes. And so under WTO, these are allowed. An interesting fact is that most developed nations provide their farmers with the kinds of subsidies which are categorized under this box, whereas the way India or the way other developing nations provide subsidies to their farmers have been categorized under trade distorting, and it is a pressure on them to put an end or at least reduce these subsidies, which of course is in favor of developed nations. Then recently, there has been a push for change in definition of developing country under the principle of special and differential treatment. So which talks about upgrading certain developing countries from the status of developing. And this is going to deeply impact not just India, but many other countries like China, Egypt, Turkey, as well as South Africa. And the reason behind this is that there is an assumption that these countries have benefited immensely from WTO rules since its formation in 1995. And there is also a belief that these countries have progressed enough that they should not be getting benefits of a developing country. And so that is also going to act in favor of developed nations. Then a very important and a good thing about WTO is that all decisions are made on consensus. There is no concept of voting, and unless and until all the members agree to a particular agreement, that shall not come into force. That is a good thing, but that itself has become the biggest roadblock in the progress of WTO. Since the members of WTO are clearly divided between developed, or you can say global north versus global south, there has been a lack of development on any of the major agreements in last 20 years. And there is a fragmentation among countries. So for example, developed countries want to push their agenda with respect to rules on e-commerce, investment, intellectual property rights. But exactly on these agenda, developing countries are quite reluctant. Similarly, developing countries want to push for reform of agreement on agriculture, which developed countries are not interested because they already are having a lot of benefits from that. Then there are other issues as well. For example, agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, or acronymed as TRIPS, which is an international legal agreement between all the member nations of WTO with respect to rules regarding protection of intellectual property rights. For example, protection of patents, copyrights, logos, and various other such creations for companies from one country into another. It establishes minimum standards for regulation by national governments of different forms of IP. And it has been mainly criticized by developing countries because of its discriminatory nature. Because it is discriminatory in nature. Why is it discriminatory? Because most of the intellectual properties are owned by countries which belong to developed world. And now they want to sell their products in developing countries but want their IPRs to be protected at the same level as they are protected in developed countries. And now this is leading to creation of artificial scarcity of products, which can be okay in some cases but cannot be good in various fields. For example, in medical fields, in pharmaceuticals. Let's take an example of a medicine. Let's say if India has weak IPR laws and if a company somehow manages to develop the same medicine which is being sold in America and it starts the manufacturing. That is not possible right now, but at least it is going to save a lot of lives. But with imposition of strict TRIPS laws, only company A, which originally manufactured that medicine, is allowed to sell products in the developing countries as well. Then the next issue arises from dispute resolution mechanism of WTO. Dispute settlement system, or DSS, is a mechanism to resolve trade dispute between and among member states. The members of DSS are also appointed by consensus, and so if one of the member blocks the appointment, it shall become dysfunctional, and it has become dysfunctional since 2019 because of lot of trouble being created by United States, which has led to very low number of judges to produce rulings. There are just not enough judges to produce rulings, and it has led to a huge backlog of cases pending in DSS. And finally, when the countries grow very powerful, they start resorting to unilateral tariffs. If you are reading newspaper, you must have read that in past 2 to 3 years, how China and USA have unilaterally imposed various kinds of tariffs on each other products without paying heed to the rules and procedures of WTO. Similarly, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, many countries, including India, have resorted to protectionism despite WTO in existence. So clearly you can understand that challenges in front of WTO are not small. There are mega challenges which the new Director General would have to face. So in this regard, in this discussion, we started by first understanding the context in which the parent body or the predecessor of WTO was formed, that is GATT. That context was extreme protectionism, to counter which a GATT was established, which then passed on the baton to WTO. Then we understood what advantages have been arrived, how it has worked in favor of increasing the global trade, but nonetheless it has its fair share of challenges and issues which needs to be resolved pretty soon. Let us now move on to the next discussion. Extended exclusion. With or without AFSPA, Centre should not allow Manipur situation to fester. So hill areas in Manipur will continue to be under the Armed Forces Special Power Act for another 6 months from October. Now when we talk about AFSPA, it's a very serious matter, not only for the country but also from the perspective of civil services examination. AFSPA, which confers special powers upon the Indian Army in disturbed areas and legitimizes basically any actions they might take in disturbed areas. The law, however, has been misinterpreted by many, and there are calls for revocation of the AFSPA, whether it is warranted, misplaced, or whether it is totally unnecessary. There is hardly any law in the Indian statutory provisions. There is hardly any other law in India's history which has been as debated as AFSPA. Not just that, from the perspective of mains examination, this is very important topic. Because first and foremost, AFSPA is deployed in areas where there is an issue with the public order, where there is already high level of extremism or insurgency. And so if you look at the GS paper 3 syllabus, it gets fit into all the lines of the syllabus. We talk about challenges to internal security, when we talk about security challenges and their management in border areas, when we talk about linkages between development and spread of extremism, it is applicable everywhere. And from the perspective of civil services examination, first we have to understand the provisions of AFSPA. Why is it needed? Why are there so many protests against AFSPA, for the revocation of AFSPA? And finally, is there something we can do about and maintain a right balance so that AFSPA is used in the way it was first envisaged to be? So whenever you have a recollection of AFSPA over the years, you recall several voices of protest. There was this 11-year-long fast by Ram Sharmila, the Manipur activist, demanding a repeal of the law. Even before that, in 2004, various civil society groups in Manipur launched an intense agitation after the death of Manorma Devi, a civilian who died in the custody of Assam Rifles. In 2005, following her death, the Union Home Minister visited Manipur and instituted a commission under Justice Jeevan Reddy, which also asked for the modification or repeal of AFSPA. And so similarly, there have been a lot of committees and the recommendations, and various state governments from time to time have demanded the repeal of AFSPA, or at least modification in the way it functions. And even before we delve into the provisions, it is necessary to examine the context in which AFSPA is used. During exceptional situations of internal disturbance in India, the Indian Army is called in to quell the potential and actual violence. Now, in such a context, the Army is given extraordinary powers under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Now, the armed forces generally cannot be deployed against Indian citizens unless a local government or central government asks the army to intervene in a situation that the government is unable to handle. In short, the army is called in only after the local police action has failed and insurgents have gained an upper hand. The danger in such a situation is that it is possible for insurgents to take over and make a state secede from the union. This obviously is unacceptable, and so in such situations a need was felt to create an act which would have certain different powers as envisaged in various criminal procedure codes and in the Constitution of India. And that is how AFSPA, or Armed Forces Special Powers Act, came into existence. So it was enacted in 1958. That was the first time it was enacted, which grants, as we have discussed, extraordinary powers and immunity to armed forces to bring back order in disturbed areas. We will understand what this means. So moving on to the provisions. As we have seen, it provides special powers to Indian armed forces, and it empowers the governor of the state or the central government to declare any part of the state as disturbed areas, if in its opinion there exists a dangerous situation in the said area which makes it necessary to deploy armed forces in that particular region and to restore public order. Now, when state governor calls for army intervention, that seems okay, but how can central government instruct army to be deployed in a particular state? And that power comes from Article 355. So if you read Article 355, it says that the duty of the Union to protect states against external aggression and internal disturbance. It shall be the duty of Union to protect every state against external aggression and internal disturbance, and to ensure that the government of every state is carried on in accordance with the provision of the Constitution. So even if the state government is not in agreement for the deployment of armed forces, central government can basically shove an army in a particular area if the government feels that that particular area is disturbed. Now, what if a particular area is declared as disturbed area and army is deployed? What are the powers which are then given to armed forces, which have been very contentious since then? So AFSPA allows the authorized officers to open fire at any individual even if it results in the death of the individual. The armed forces get power to arrest anyone, search any property or any person, and seize which may be necessary to restore the order in a disturbed area without the warrant. And the most problematic part of whole AFSPA is legal immunity to army. Armed forces personnel have complete legal immunity or indemnity for their actions as far as those actions were committed in disturbed areas. So you can understand that not only that AFSPA provides very wide and blanket powers to armed forces, and that is the reason that it has always been hated by the people on which it has been levied. But according to the government of India, extraordinary situations demand extraordinary measures, and that is how AFSPA is justified. Of course, the application of AFSPA has led to restoring of order in various areas. It allows for effective functioning. It is essential for armed forces to function effectively in insurgency and militancy affected areas. But the laws which exist normally in a particular area in normal situations might hinder in the way they function against terrorist organizations, against insurgents. And to empower armed forces to make them feel confident, it is important to enshrine them with such powers. At the end of the day, we have to ensure security of nation, and hence provisions of this act have played a crucial role in maintaining law and order in disturbed areas, thus protecting sovereignty and security of the nation. And then finally, we need to protect the members of armed forces. It is crucial to empower members of armed forces who constantly face threat to their lives at the hands of insurgents and militants. Its withdrawal would result in poor morale. Apart from that, you have to remember one thing, that extraordinary powers are also necessary as the armed forces face asymmetric warfare involving raids, ambushes, mines and explosive devices, even sabotage. And so it is important to empower them with such powers. But that absolutely does not mean that AFSPA has not been misused. In fact, there have been documented abuse of power. It has been alleged that immunity granted by the Act has led the armed forces to misuse the powers and commit offences like enforced disappearances, fake encounters, and sexual assault. For example, Justice Verma Committee on Offences Against Women in Conflict Areas said AFSPA legitimizes impunity for sexual violence. Justice Santosh Hegde Committee to investigate fake encounters in Manipur described it as a symbol of oppression, and Justice Jeevan Reddy Committee recommended removal of absolute immunity under AFSPA. Then, of course, it is a threat to fundamental rights, especially when it perpetuates in a particular area for 50 years. It leads to suspension of fundamental rights and liberties guaranteed to the citizens by the Constitution, and hence weakens democracy. Human rights violations in AFSPA areas are not inquired into and followed by adequate action. Thus, it is against the principle of natural justice, because of which the credibility of Indian democracy is diminished. There are certain areas where insurgency and terrorism got bolstered as a result of AFSPA, because people's disillusionment with the democratic setup is exploited by secessionists and terror sympathizers, which leads to more violence and more counter-violence, creating a vicious cycle. Then, according to some of the people, it has proven to be ineffective. Critics argue that this act has failed in its objective of restoring normalcy in disturbed areas, although being in existence for about 50 years. And then finally, the areas which might be declared by the government as disturbed areas is beyond the judicial review, which in essence violates the basic structure to the Constitution of India. So what exactly can we do going forward? And there are 4 sets of measures which can be taken. Adherence to human rights. It needs to be emphasized that human rights compliance and operational effectiveness are not constraining requirements. In fact, adherence to human rights norms and principles strengthens the counter-insurgency capability of force. At the same time, we need robust safeguards. For example, every death caused by armed forces in a disturbed area, be it of a common person or a criminal, should be thoroughly inquired into. Then we need to remove ambiguity in the law. The terms like disturbed, dangerous, and land forces need to be clearly defined to ensure greater clarity. And finally, we need to ensure transparency. Greater transparency in communicating the status of existing cases to include its display on the Army and government's website. Proactive feedback to petitioners on actions taken by government in past human rights cases are some of the reforms which we can bring about to break this vicious cycle of counter-terrorist activity, fueling insurgency, and then again emboldening the state's response. So this topic is fairly important from the perspective of prelims examination, but there the focus would be limited only on provisions, while from the perspective of mains examination the focus would be on merits and demerits and way forward for AFSPA. Let's now move on to the next article.